What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the $1 Pound Show. My name's Joey. Today we have a very special guest. His name is Rob Grysen. He's with Kind Farms here in Monterey County, California, I should say. And Rob is a very special guest because he has an extensive background in companies and industries that are heavily regulated, including the food industry. And I thought it would be very interesting to have Rob on today to explore a little bit about what he's done in the past and what he's doing today, and see kind of how they correlate together, and possibly talk about where cannabis is going in the future in America and, of course, the world. So, Rob, thank you for taking the time to join me today. I appreciate it very much.
Hey, thanks, Joey. Happy to be here. I'm excited to do this with you.
Awesome. And just to get started, what I like to do with most folks that are coming on the podcast is just give anyone listening a little bit of a background on you, kind of where you've come from in the sense of your career and what you've done in the past, and then how you got into cannabis.
Sure. So I started, I think, a little bit different than a lot of people in this industry. I started in the pharmaceuticals. I started with a company that we made heparin saline flushes for IVs. Then shortly after that, I took a job at a much larger pharmaceutical company out of Boulder, Colorado. And worked in the chemistry and microbiology departments there for a few years before making a transition into food. It turned into very much just a job, right? I showed up at 8 o'clock, I left at 5 o'clock, and didn't get anything else out of it. So food was a nice refresher for me. It was a new challenge with similar types of things that I found in pharma. So took a job with a company called Boulder Brands at the time. I worked at their Evol facility where we made a variety of different CPG food products. I was there for a few years, and then got a phone call from a crazy little company out in San Francisco called Hampton Creek at the time. Now it's Just Inc. And what they do there is they're a food technology company. They're heavily backed and do a lot of R&D. Maybe some of your listeners have heard of them. Their goal is to replace conventional animal protein products with plant-based protein products. So they have a line of it's vegan product, eggless mayo. There's dressings. There was cookies. There was edible cookie dough. But really, their big product is a product called Just Egg, which is an egg type product that is made from the mung bean. It's a specific protein in the mung bean, and that allows this liquid product to be put in a frying pan and scramble like an egg, taste like an egg, smell like an egg. And we also, during my time there, we also were in the meat market. So we were growing lab grown meat in bioreactors. So I can say that I'm one of the first in the world to eat a lab grown chicken nugget while the chicken was still alive. I've also had pork chorizo and chicken skin and a couple other products.
Are they making products? I mean, when you said they're trying to replace meat products, is that, I guess, similar to what Burger King rolled out recently with their Impossible Whopper, where I think it's made out of plants?
Yeah. So the big difference there is that is a vegetable burger. The difference of what they're doing now at Just is they're growing meat in the same way that a chicken grows its own meat. This bioreactor offers a good environment, the right food, the right time, the right temperature, the right pH, and they take cells from a chicken, they grow those cells, and so in a way it is very similar or the same. I don't want to get controversial, but it would be considered meat rather than a vegetable based meal like the Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat.
And when you were working there, since we talk about cannabis compliance a lot on this podcast, I mean, what sort of things did you see compliance wise, or what kind of regulations or daily rules did you have to make sure you followed when you were operating?
Yeah, so depending on what you're doing in the food world specifically, it informs who you are regulated by. So I've got a lot of experience in both USDA and FDA regulation. USDA is predominantly meat regulation, also imports and exports, and then FDA is basically involved all the time. They regulate is very different than what the cannabis industry has been doing, at least to start. One, obviously, we're not at a federal regulatory body yet. It's more local, which is also the case in food, right? You still deal with the public health department in California. You still deal with CDFA, but the way that they regulate and what they regulate is slightly different. For example, testing. Testing is a big thing that comes up in the cannabis industry because it is a requirement. For FDA, there is no prescriptive, here's what you must test, here's the specific levels that you must hit across the board, because there's so many different products that fall within the purview of FDA. It is your job as a manufacturer of that food to evaluate the risk of that product, put the correct parameters in place to control that product, test that product to the levels at which you believe and have defined as your food safety criteria or your quality criteria, and then you release that product into the marketplace. And then obviously, if and when there is a problem, that product will be retracted the same way that it is in cannabis. And then what often happens is the FDA will sorry about that. What often happens is then the FDA will give you a call, especially if there's a recall event, and they'll want to walk through all of the things that you did to define the safety of that product. How did you manage your raw material suppliers? How did you manage your processing environment? And how else did you keep that product safe? Testing to them is more of a check at the end to make sure that all the things that you did prior to that worked, rather than a standard to release a product.
How often are product recalls occurring in that industry?
Oh, every single day, many of which you probably never hear of. The recall system is still very archaic in a lot of ways. For example, the way that a lot of grocery stores post a recall is they print out a flyer and put it on their front door. There's no way to reach the consumer that purchased that product. Obviously, on the news, you see these huge recalls, often related to deaths or a lot of people getting sick, like the cantaloupe outbreak, the romaine outbreak that happened really the last couple of years. But there's many recalls, often related to mislabeling, allergen cross-contamination, food safety issues that happen that you have never heard of.
And how many recalls have you personally had experience with, that you've had to kind of lead handling those recalls?
So one big one. It happened at the previous company. There was a contamination in one of the raw products that we used. It was in some coconut milk powder. We had some pathogens in there. It was a dry mix, so think like cake mix, muffin mix, brownie mix type of product. We made a whole bunch of it. Unfortunately, almost all of that had that raw material in it, and we did everything that I just described, right? We had all of our processes in place. We verified our raw materials, our vendors. We made sure that there was good sanitation in place. But often, no matter how good you are, at some point you're gonna have an issue. And unfortunately for us, that happened in the form of a pathogen that we found after many runs. And that is because pathogens are not homogeneous through a batch. They're often found in small hotspots. Could be in the corner of one box out of a lot of 1,000 boxes. So we found it. Most of that product was at the largest retailer in this country, a little company called Walmart. You may have heard of them. Most of that product went to them. So was on the phone with them, was on the phone with the FDA, bringing that product back. We ended up doing a complete recall of every product produced. It was a fairly new product, so but it was very extensive. It took a lot of time. It was fortunately for us, we had a very good system. But I can imagine for smaller, more mom and pop companies that maybe don't have the resources to put into a large food safety and quality team, a regulatory team, I could imagine that the challenges for them could be significantly higher.
And I would imagine that, obviously these large companies, there's got to be some sort of insurance, right? Like product recall insurance or something to recoup their loss. Is that it, right?
Yeah, there is. It doesn't cover everything, but there is insurance. Fortunately for me, I was able to avoid a lot of that. That was
Right.
predominantly run through our legal team. And yeah.
And product recalls for cannabis, it hasn't really been a big thing yet. It's going to be. Obviously, the latest thing in cannabis that circles around the recall side of it is going to be the vape pens. A lot of folks are well aware of what's been in the news lately with cannabis vape pens causing harm to people. In many cases, actually, people have been dying from cannabis vape pens, according to the news and the latest reports. And luckily, it seems that almost all of these outbreaks have been associated with the black market and not the licensed market. So I haven't really read any news about people buying a vape pen from a licensed dispensary and then having any sort of health issues related to that. But it's going to be interesting to see in the next, maybe year or so, whether that dies down or it stays a hot topic, and also how the agencies are going to react to that in regards to product recalls and in regards to, maybe checking product and doing spot checking on the floors, which is kind of my next question for you is, I think you talked about testing being done to kind of verify what you guys did from a manufacturing standpoint. And is that kind of what they would do? They would go to like a Walmart and pull a random food item off the shelf and then test it to verify, X amount of things. Is that usually how that worked?
Yeah, that for sure happens in both USDA and FDA during an audit. Especially with USDA, in my experience with USDA at least, they would come in, they would do their audit. A USDA inspector is actually on site every day that you run which is very, very different than the FDA. Now that might be for 20 minutes because they have to cover many, many plants in that area, or if you're the only plant running, they'll be there 24 hours a day. So during their time there, they're constantly verifying that you're following your procedures. They're out on the floor inspecting the product, and they're taking swabs and different different food samples and sending that to their lab to verify it. Now, fortunately for us, we didn't have an instance where they found something that we did not find. And when we did get hits for specific things, it's nice to have them there because then you can work directly with them on a daily basis to get the issue resolved to their standard as well as your own. FDA is a different story. FDA, depending on your risk level, depending on your history, if you have had multiple recalls, maybe FDA ups their visit frequency. But I've been to many, many food plants that I have run the food safety quality regulatory team. I've been to many co-manufacturing plants, which is a very common thing in the cannabis industry as well. And you get a huge variety. Sometimes you have FDA inspectors showing up every 6 months. Sometimes it's every other year. They generally show up for a day, maybe 2 days, depending on how big your plant is, how intricate the processes are, how many clients you have, how much documentation they need to go through. But generally, the way it works is they come in, they do an audit, assuming everything goes relatively okay. They sit down with you at the end of that. They go through their findings, and then a couple of weeks later, in the mail, you get the full write-up from the inspection. You have a certain amount of days to fulfill the corrective action for that, and then you resubmit those to them. and then they may or may not come back.
And I'm assuming they just show up, right? Are they giving you any heads up before they come, or is it just, hey, here I
No,
am?
never. No, they always, it's always a, hey, here I am. So stop everything you're doing because you're having an audit today.
And then, I mean, yeah, that must be difficult. Actually, you made a good point. So that would be why maybe the company has like someone like you or someone that's actually just dedicated to be there for those audits. I would assume, right? Because you don't want like one of your main production guys to get pulled away by the FDA if you're still trying to run your business and trying to produce product, right?
Yeah, you have to, at least at some level, somebody that is responsible for the quality system at your company. And the reason for that is not only do you not want to pull specific people off of the production floor because you don't want to stop everything, because even those inspectors want to see you running, right? They
Right.
want to verify that what you put on paper is what you're doing in practice. But you want somebody that really knows what they're talking about, not just being able to read what is written on a piece of paper. They want somebody that understands the methodology of how you got to getting those words on paper, right? What was the methodology that you used to make sure that this, for example, cleaning program is functional, it works, and you have a, I can't say guaranteed because you're going to have issue, but you have a very high likelihood of having a clean line, a clean equipment. How did you get there?
Right. Is there any, I know cannabis is treated differently just because we're still kind of looked at as criminals in a way, or suspected of being some sort of criminals in one way or another. Is there any requirements that you guys had in regards to surveillance or video recording on your sites, or is that not really a thing?
It would be more of an internal thing. It would be a company decision. I know. I've been on in many food plants that I am 100% sure there is not a camera. Maybe a doorbell, maybe a doorbell to get in. But there's a lot of companies that do have surveillance, especially on the exterior of the building, around the perimeters. But there is no mandated camera requirement.
And going back to when you dealt with audits, I think you said that the USDA would be the ones that would come and essentially have like an office at your location, right? Because they'd be there all day or sometimes multiple days. And FDA was more come and go depending on who you are, what they got going on. They'll be there long or not. Um, when the USDA came and they had an office there, is it usually just like one inspector that shows up? Is it kind of two or three? What's the quantity of inspectors that are roaming around your facility to do those inspections?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're doing. So if you're a slaughterhouse, you might have multiple inspectors. You might actually have or I haven't worked in a slaughterhouse. So I don't know if it's a requirement or not. But you also have a USDA veterinarian on site to inspect the animal's health. For us, we were on the back end of all that. So we would receive processed meat products and turn them into burritos or dinner bowls or things like that. So we would generally, for our size, we would have one at least on a daily basis. Now that would be two or three or four inspectors sharing that load, but it's not like we had four inspectors roaming the floor at any given time.
Gotcha.
Generally speaking, one, for at least from my experience.
And are the inspectors, I mean, what's their attitudes usually like? Do they come across as friendly and educational? Do they come across as mean and trying to catch you and make a mistake at any given turn? What's kind of the vibe with those inspectors?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the inspector. Some of them are trying to catch you. Some of them are trying to help you. But at least in my experience, the auditors want you to do the right thing. And if you're doing the right thing, then they're generally pretty helpful. But they have a job to do. Their job is not to be your friend. Their job is to make sure that you're following not only the regulation, but also your processes, right, and how you interpret those regulations and how you control both of those things. So I would say, generally speaking, it was a very good relationship. Sometimes sometimes they're a pain in the ass because they want you to do things that they want done immediately, even things not specifically related to food safety or to quality, but you just deal with it, right? You get used to them being there. You expect them to show up. They often would come in, they would sit down in my office with me, and we'd go over things that we discussed, over the course of the last couple of days, and giving updates of corrective actions. And in a lot of ways, they're giving you heads up of things that they want you to address so that they don't have to write you up, right? They want you to fix it, and they want you to show that it is a priority for you. So as long as you can maintain a good, healthy relationship, you listen to them, you do the things that they want you to do, I would say it was fine. It was just normal.
When it comes to the regulations, in cannabis, we don't really have any federal regulations, obviously, at the moment, other than don't do it at all. But we generally have the state laws, and then at least in California, we have local control. So the cities and counties can also have regulations that aren't allowed to be, more loose than state laws, but can be more strict than state laws. Is that similar when it comes to food regulation? Or is it just, hey, you just kind of follow whatever the federal agencies say and that's it? Or are certain states allowing certain things or more loose than others?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't speak for the state level stuff. I just don't have enough experience with so many states. My predominant experience is in Colorado and California. California is a little bit more prescriptive than what I was used to, but I would say not overly burdensome, especially with the Prop 65 stuff. But in general, the state level regulations and the federal level regulations are not so different. Same in cannabis, right? You have different people representing different agencies as well. Here in Monterey County, we have the Ag Commissioner office that represents Cannabis. They'll come out, they'll do the observations, they'll come and visit the farm on a fairly frequent basis, and they're there as representatives of Cannabis. In California, it's similar. You can have the FDA show up at any given time, but you can also have public health show up at any given time to perform FDA audits. They represent FDA in California. So it's similar. It's similar in that way.
And let's get into the parallels between your previous life and your new fun and exciting cannabis life that you're living these days. I don't know if you ever imagined that you would be around thousands of cannabis plants while you were at work, but here you are. You and I have talked a little bit offline about this, but let's talk about it here online. Where do you see, with your experience in FDA, USDA, all these regulatory businesses that are heavily regulated, I should say, where do you see cannabis going? Where do you see it going in the future, or how do you see it being regulated? Is it eventually going to fall under the FDA and be similar to your prior experiences? What are your thoughts on that?
I hope so. I actually might be in the minority when we talk about regulations for this industry, because I appreciate what they're trying to do. Like myself, all of us in this industry are a part of the very, very beginning, and that includes all of these agencies as they relate to cannabis as well. So we are all on a very similar learning curve. What we do here at this farm is we are cultivators, processors, and distributors. So I can't speak much to the manufacturing side, but I would imagine, and this is just a guess, I would imagine that we will someday be a federally regulated industry, that we can go across state lines and be audited by federally leveled regulatory bodies, such as the FDA and USDA. Now, both of those agencies have have roots in agriculture. So I think it will depend on how this industry is defined, right? Is this agriculture? Is this something else? Is it a little bit of both? But if I had to guess, it will lean more towards FDA. And I think when that day comes, it will be very, especially as on the manufacturing side.
And what do you think? You touched on a little bit earlier when you talked about the mom and pop shops. What do you think would be the best case scenario as far as where cannabis ends up and how it ends up being treated for the mom and pops to still have somewhat of a chance to be a participant in this industry? And what do you think would be the worst case scenario where they are absolutely, not going to be a part of it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I think it'll depend on resources and the level of requirement from these agencies. Today, you are required to have a lot of things that I would say have not necessarily been fully flushed out. I think one of those examples is metric. Metric is a totally fine system, right? That is a very conventional thing in food and pharma, in any cosmetics, right? Is basically a traceability program. Now, do I think that there's been enough training? Do I think that there's been enough time and vetting to make sure that the system is applicable to all different types of operations? I don't think so. I don't think that we have enough data to say that. Right? I know for sure that we struggle as a cultivator system that we think should be a part of being an operator. It should have some allowances to do things, but because what they're trying to do is cover many different areas of the cannabis industry and make it into one style of traceability, it makes it difficult, but you still have to abide by those. Now, will those guidelines open up a little bit? Not loosen, but open, be a little bit more broad? If yes, then the smaller mom and pops will have an opportunity. And I don't know what you define as small, but by small, I'm talking, licenses, but the small licenses.
Yeah.
I think that we're going to have some giants too. I think we're going to have some Walmarts and Targets, the big guys. They're not going to have a problem. They're going to not have an issue with resourcing. They're not going to have an issue with payroll. But these small mom and pops, if they don't have the resources to fulfill the requirements of a quality system, which would include quality and, I'll call it food safety because we haven't identified, I guess, cannabis safety, that they're going to need some resources, whether that's a person, additional training, maybe loosened restrictions based on their size. I hope that there's an opportunity because those people are very important to this industry as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective and thought you said there. Maybe looser restrictions depending on their size. That's not the worst idea. I can see some people being totally against that, but I can also see a lot of people being for that. And it does kind of make sense because if you're not a giant operation, then perhaps you don't need to follow so many rules and regulations because you're just not going to, I guess in a way have as much of an effect on the market or be able to
Sure.
put product out to as many people as others can. So that's a good point you made. And I wanted to touch on metric actually, since you brought that up. And it's a very hot topic right now in cannabis since everyone's, slowly getting on it. And certainly by the end of this year, I think everybody will be on it. When it comes to setting up a tracking system to have accountability for your products and to ultimately roll out a proper product recall if you need to, what was it like in your other experiences? Did you have like a set way that you had to track product that the government was kind of mandating or telling you how to do it? Or was it kind of like as long as you met certain criteria, they let you do it how you wanted?
Yeah, so there was no reporting on a daily, I guess metric is, I guess, supposed to be as real time as possible. There was no reporting back to the FDA or to some state level agency. Your job was to be able to recall product if and when you needed to recall product. So many places, even in 2018, 2019, many food companies are still 100% paper based, 100%.
Wow.
And that is most of the smaller companies that we would work with. So if and when we had an issue, we would say, all right, pull the records for the last 6 months and let's start chugging through them. Fortunately for us, we had a system, a third-party software, very similar to what we have now, that as long as you build in the correct criteria into the system at the beginning, the traceability is very easy. As long as you're monitoring it on a daily basis, making sure that people are scanning barcodes, they're scanning lot codes, the location of that product is set appropriately, and depending on who you sell that product to, sometimes that goes to a distributor, sometimes that goes directly to the end user. You should have an emergency contact list for all of those people. So our responsibility, for example, is if we were selling a product to a distributor, we would be required to notify the people before us. So let's say it was a raw material that had an issue. We would be required to go back to that person and notify them of the issue that we found, and then also notify that distributor. And then that distributor will then follow that traceability to whoever they sold that to, whether that's another distributor or usually an end user at that point. But there's like I said, there's very little like store level traceability. Once it gets into a store, most places can't then translate that to an end user. Costco is a great example. They have an amazing food safety program and quality system. And this is another level. It's not necessarily regulation, but you have federal regulation, you have state and local regulation, and then you also have customers. And depending on who that customer is, they may or may not have their own audits. Costco, for example, was one of the hardest, out of all of them, one of the harder audits that they will send a Costco representative to come and do an audit prior to or during purchasing a product for their stores. And luckily for them, because it's a subscription program to shop at Costco, they know what subscribers are purchasing. So they are able to then go to that end user, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Shout out to Costco for doing a good job. And you said that basically everything was done or is being done by paper in these other industries. And I think that, when we talk about this new burden of metric on the cannabis industry, I don't think it's just the fact that we're having to follow stringent track and trace regulations. I think it is the technology side of it that is very difficult for a lot of people, particularly people who may be, more living off the land type of folks, maybe people who live up in Humboldt and who have just had their outdoor grows for years and years and years that can barely even use a computer because they just don't have any interest in it, and I think the fact that everything is so technology is so integrated into this, and you have to have internet and you have to have all these things. I think that's one of the major things that's causing people problems in the cannabis industry, and certainly slowing down the supply chain and slowing down how fast we can get products to market. I mean, there's other things obviously like waiting for test results to come back, but that's really the biggest thing that I've seen that folks are having to get used to, and or having to hire someone to help them get done, because having to, for example, all of your waste has to be reported in metric within 3 days of it occurring. Your harvest has to be completely done, within 60 days. These types of things are a big deal for a lot of folks who are used to just, chopping down the plants, hanging it, trimming it, then selling it. Now there's all these things that are in the way to get to your end goal of selling your product. It would be nice if we can do it all by paper, and I think a lot of people would prefer that, but I mean, here we are, and we kind of have to deal with it. And
yeah. I think the tricky thing is now, especially in this day and age, technology is, I think it is the right answer, right? I'm an advocate for regulation and for traceability. Whether or not I think that the folks that you're talking about are probably relatively small group in the entirety of the industry. And the paper-based systems are not good, right? Because you also have to think of why have that system, right? Why is that in place? It is to protect the safety of the people that you're then selling your product to. Emergency that you had to pull product out immediately. In an electronic system, it will take you seconds or maybe minutes, right, to have a full traceability report printed out, ready to call the FDA or whoever your regulatory body is or your distributor, right? Literally seconds or minutes. In a paper-based program, that might take you 24 hours. That might be the difference of people eating something that it could harm them, right? That could be, for us in food, it's not an issue so much in cannabis, at least I hope not, is a lot of the products that we would make are targeted for babies, children, pregnant women, elderly. And so those people, when you're thinking about adverse health effects, are probably the most susceptible. And your goal is to get that information out as quickly as possible to avoid having a much, much larger issue. So the paper-based system, no matter how good your documentation is, it still is going to take you time and people, and most likely there's probably going to be errors as well, right? It's much, much harder to control a paper-based system. Now, whether or not technology is ready to go for this entire industry, probably not, right? You do have those people that might not have internet, might not have the training required to run these programs. But on the other side, I understand why that this is a requirement and why it's an electronic requirement. It's so that these agencies that are also still learning, they need to be able to collect this data and do something with it, right? If they're just collecting data for fun, then I agree this is probably a waste of time. If they're collecting this data to do something with it, to monitor people that are high risk to be in the black market, to change the way that they approach regulations through the data collected. Also, obviously, the town halls that they have, it's very important that we go and represent ourselves as an industry at these town halls, because they should understand how the data is created and where it comes from as well. But I mean, I am an advocate for traceability, whether that's metric or some other means. I'm a little bit indifferent.
Let's get a little bit into, basically what you're doing today and what you've been doing, the past. How long have you been in cannabis now? Has it been like a year or longer than that?
It'll be almost a year. I think I came on board November 2nd.
Oh, wow.
Ish. So it's coming up on my 1-year anniversary. But it took me a year to come on board as well. It took some time and some convincing, but yeah, almost a year under the belt now.
So what has it been like for you in the past year to come into this new industry that is still very much being figured out and still has a very long way to go? I mean, what has it been like learning more about cannabis and bringing on your prior experiences to the new endeavor you're a part of?
I would say it has been very interesting and very exciting and very different. The industry, I think, as a whole, will move in a even more regulated way. But it's been very interesting coming in. I've had more audits in the past year from someone, whether that's a local agency, whether or not that's a state agency. I mean, you name it. I'm not the only one. I think just about every cannabis company has had very similar experiences in the last year than I had in the last 7 combined. So that part has been very interesting. What people look for, the audits itself, this to me are not real audits. These are like check-ins, right? It's almost more of a tour of a facility more than anything else. And obviously they are looking for specific things. But an audit to me is very different than what occurs today. right? An audit is like, all right, let's sit down and I have your full attention for the next 10 hours, and I want you to pull these specific programs and this specific data. I want to review that data, show me these test results, dot, 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 dot. Now it's, depending on who it is, they come in, they might measure some canopy, they might look at your water system, they might look at the number of employees or how are your scales sealed. So these are more check-ins than audits for me. So that has been a very different experience in this industry. I see that changing. I think relatively quickly. I think in the near future that will change, especially once this grace period of metric is done. That's an assumption. I think that there's some grace period where they're allowing people to figure it out. But I think that at some point that's going to end, and the audit style is going to change. I just don't know when.
I think the other big difference would be that when you were dealing with USDA or FDA, more than likely, I'm guessing that a lot of those inspectors had probably been doing it for a very long time and were more than likely very experienced. In this, like you said earlier, these are just kind of check-ins, and I think a large reason why you guys get in a check-in or inspected quite often is honestly because they want to learn from you, especially the operation you're a part of. You guys are probably one of the most professional operations that I've seen, at least one of them for sure. And I think every time they come visit you, they're probably like thinking, okay, this is how it's supposed to be done, or this is maybe what I should be looking for at other places.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. A lot of work has gone into doing this right. That's why when we took over the property, we purchased the property that we're at now, December 2017, and we didn't start growing for more than a year. Right, we spent that time going through the paces, getting the cannabis business permit, getting the CUP, getting all of our state licenses, and so before we put a plant on the ground, we had all of those. Right, they were done. It's very, very different than many of the companies, at least in this area. But sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Happens a lot in this industry. No, I mean we're just touching on basically the fact that the operation that you guys have at Kind Farms is very professional.
Yes,
and very, very straight laced compared to a lot of folks.
Yeah, it's the visits, the audits, whatever we want to call them. I tell the folks here, I love doing it because I really do want people to feel comfortable with this industry. I think when people come on to this property, at least, they come in with this sense of I don't really understand this yet. This industry, this type of growing, this product, right? This product has been in a bad light for a long time, and so you have these regulators that may or may not be proponents of this product as an industry. They come on site, and this is a generalization, but I would say generally true. There's a point, maybe 5 minutes in to the visit, where people start to smile because they recognize that most of the stuff that they see in other places in other industries that they audit are in place here as well. It's just done in a slightly different way, right? It might not be as intricate as it is when they go and audit food companies or pharmaceutical companies or cosmetic companies. It might not be perfect, but when they come in and they start seeing the things that they're used to, they start to realize, oh, okay, like I understand this. I don't necessarily understand that product yet, or that industry yet, but I understand the processes that you are putting in place. And a lot of those processes are mandated by BCC and CDFA. It's just a matter of how you then implement them in your operation.
Here's a question for you that I think a lot of people might be interested in. Obviously you guys are, sometimes it might not feel like it to you yet, but from the outside looking in, you guys are the big boys. You're these big companies that are coming in, to the industry. And there's a lot of people who are not quite as large or maybe not as well funded, who would want to know an answer to this question, in my opinion. The question is, what has been the biggest challenge for you guys in getting this thing going, and maybe a continuing challenge for you guys from the cannabis side? What do you think is the toughest thing to deal with?
I think for us is just timing. I think timing is the hardest thing, because you're dealing with so many levels of people, right? That starts internally. Obviously, everybody internally has priorities, but then you're dealing with a lot of local regulatory bodies, and within those locals, there are many different departments and divisions, which all need to align in order for things to move forward. Then you have your state level, which those two, the local jurisdictions and the state, are communicating with each other. And so for us, we want to be able to move forward because we believe that we are doing it right. And like I said, it took us a year to get many of these licenses and permits under our belt. That's a year of somebody being dedicated to thinking about it, approaching the things that they come back with corrective actions on, being thoughtful in how we think about the future, and then being able to pay for those things, even in the absence of having plants on the ground to give you some kind of revenue. So I think for us, that part is behind us in a way. Obviously, there's some reoccurring maintenance and annual fees, but I feel bad for a lot of the people that have not yet approached, especially the business permit. It is an extensive process, especially if there is an issue on your property or in your process that needs to be addressed. It'll be interesting. I don't think that there was a lot of people going through that process while we did, and now you're going to start seeing a massive influx. The teams, I would say, generally are understaffed, especially here in Monterey County. The people that I work with, they mean well. They want to get this stuff done with people. But when you're dealing with one or two people and you've got 10, 30, 50, 100, couple hundred applicants to deal with at the same time, I just don't know how they will be able to keep up and also check their work. So I think that'll be a big challenge for people.
Yeah, I agree. One of the, you touched on it really. It's the timing, and when I deal with people contacting me who say, "Hey, I want to get in the cannabis industry. What's the first step? What do I do?" One of the very first things I talk to them about, or I ask them, is like, how well funded are you? Because one of the first things I explain to them is that while you're waiting to get permitted locally, and then while you're waiting to get licensed at the state level, more than likely you're going to have some expenses while you're waiting. Either you bought a property and now you have a lot of money that you just spent that you can't recoup just yet, or you might be leasing a property. And there's been cases like you said. I have friends of mine who have leased a property and been paying a lease for a year to maybe 18 months before they were even able to start operating. And a lot of people don't understand that that's just the way it is right now. Hopefully it gets better over time, but it is very expensive just to get started, let alone to start operating and actually, pay for operational costs. Waiting up to a year to get started is very painful. And, I remember going through that with you guys and all the stuff you had to do, all the hoops you had to jump through just to be able to get started was absolutely insane. And it's good to finally see you guys, starting to grow, both as a company and physically, and see what you're coming up with. I'm really excited to see what sort of things you guys do with technology, what things you guys are going to be bringing from these other industries that are going to apply to cannabis. And I think it's going to really educate a lot of folks around here as well. And I'm not saying that there aren't other operations around here that know what they're doing, but I think that people seeing kind of what you guys are doing is really going to help the industry as a whole. Like you said, taking what FDA and USDA has taught you, having these solid track and trace procedures in place. Ultimately, it's all going to benefit the industry, I think, and it's going to keep it more professional than it has been. I certainly don't want to lose what this industry was traditionally, about, which was like more of a culture, more of a community. I don't want to lose these smaller operations because, quite frankly, I mean, you guys can hopefully prove me wrong since you're working on it, but quite frankly, I don't really think it's that possible to have like the highest quality cannabis produced at a very large scale. I think that the boutique side of this is very important, and I think that the best cannabis is probably going to continue to come from these smaller operators who can just, quite frankly, control everything a lot better than these bigger operations. That being said, I know that there are a lot of people working towards, having a scalable, large operation that are still producing a very high quality product, and you guys are one of those people on my list to watch out for, because I think if anyone can do it, it would probably be you guys with the team that you have and the processes that you're putting in place for sure.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I agree. I don't want these small companies going out of business either. To be honest, I don't even necessarily consider us large, right? I think that we're just starting off, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens and where it goes. But I think that there's a place for every level, small and large. Um, it'll be interesting to see what happens in this industry, especially over the course of the next, I would say, 5 years.
I
I think
agree.
there's going to be, significant changes, and hopefully, for the good rather than the bad.
Yeah, it's gonna be very interesting to follow this industry over the next 5 to 10 years and see where it ends up and how it all plays out. It's changing every day, and there's always something new to talk about. And I again appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us and chat today. Hopefully, we can do it again in the near future as you get further along in your cannabis career. And just before we wrap it up, is there anything else you want to say, or is there any certain way that maybe people can reach out to you if they have more interest in what you have to say, or maybe what you guys are doing at Kind Farms?
Sure, I am happy to talk to anybody that's got questions. We all have things to learn from each other for sure. Like you said, this is my year one in this industry. I'm not coming from the cultural background that you touched on. I'm coming from a manufacturing and regulatory background. So or at least my approach is going to be very different than many other people. So people can definitely reach out. They can find me. My email. I'm happy to give out my email. It's rob@kindfarms.co. Um, if you have any questions, I'm happy.
Cool. All right, Rob. Thanks again, man. I appreciate your time, and thanks for everyone who's been listening. This is another episode of the $1 Pound Show. Hopefully, you learned something a little bit new that you didn't know about, and we got to see some of the parallels between these other industries and cannabis, and we'll continue to see where this industry is going. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.